Hello and welcome. Today I'd like to talk briefly about a couple of concepts that I think are going to set the stage for our studies over the coming semester. I actually use this video in a couple of classes, so you can apply it to the class that you're taking in which it's assigned. And the topic of today's lecture is Society's Archive, Societies, Archives plural, and Cultural Heritage Institutions. So what is a society's archive? Society's archive, singular, that is, the archive of society, is actually a conceptual idea. Conceptually, it's all the recorded knowledge existing in a society wherever it exists. And so it refers generally to anything that a culture has fixed in some kind of form. The idea applies to all societies. All societies, at least all modern societies, have recorded knowledge that's fixed in some kind of a medium. We talk about society's archive as in the human race, what that archive looks like of all recorded human knowledge. It can also apply to a single society. So we use the term to talk generally about all of the recorded information that a society produces. If we could gather it all in one place, what would it look like? What would it consist of? We can't answer it really. It's a theoretical proposition, but we could kind of sketch it out and talk generally about it, what it would consist of, what might be in it. And so this would be an important concept to discuss in your discussion groups. This concept, philosophical concept, theoretical concept of society's archive is a kind of a singular concept, talking about all recorded knowledge. Now we also talk about society's archives, plural. And when we talk about society's archives in the plural sense, we're really talking about all those institutions, organizations that store individual recorded knowledge, the physical space where we actually have place knowledge, where we've kind of organized it, where we make it available for study. Pretty much all societies, if they have recorded knowledge, also have physical collections. And so we asked the question, what would a description of the archives of a certain society look like? And we can describe those because those are actually tangible, physical institutions, buildings, places that hold things. So this is actually the tangible collection of recorded knowledge that we have. And so you want to be clear about whether we're talking about society's archives, which are the actual cultural institutions, and whether we're talking about society's archive, which is this general theoretical construct of all the information that could be described in a society. So to sum up, the difference between all that could possibly be collected, that's society's archive, the philosophical, and society's archives is the sum total of what actually is collected, what's in them. And this raises the question, what accounts for the difference? In our individual physical archives, we don't have all of recorded knowledge. Assuming it were possible to do so, and of course there's some kind of question about that, nevertheless we don't collect everything that's recorded. And there are some readings in your assignments and so on that may discuss some of these differences. We talk about pesto, which is a form of analysis, political, economical, social, technological, other, including culture and religion. These are all factors that come to bear when we talk about what actually is collected versus what could be collected. So let's talk about cultural heritage institutions. These are also sometimes called cultural memory institutions. Let's distinguish a couple of concepts. Fixed cultural heritage. This is thought fixed in some kind of a tangible medium, that is recorded knowledge. So these are artifacts, objects, anything from clay pots to books to letters written. These are things that are tangible, that are recorded in some kind of a medium and that can be preserved. As opposed to fluid cultural heritage, these are things like performances, oral presentations, musical performances, things that happen in a culture but that aren't actually fixed in any kind of a tangible medium. So cultural heritage institutions are those institutions that deal with fixed artifacts and objects. These are places for physical collection and preservation of society's archives. And modern societies, you can pick a kind of a date here, but let's just say 1800 for the sake of argument. Societies have developed different types of cultural heritage institutions dealing with different kinds of artifacts. And so the ones we're going to talk the most about in the courses here are modern archives, modern libraries, and museums. And as these have developed, they have seemed, at least up to the present time, to have diverged and come to represent different kinds of information holding organizations. So let's talk a little bit about that. The canonical definitions, when we talk about a canonical definition, we're talking about the definition of an organization as we think it should be, not necessarily what it is, but the canonical business or the practice or the main business or practice of the institution. And so modern archives deal with non-published materials. So George Washington's letters are a good example, the letters that he actually wrote. So archives deal with documents, manuscripts, images, and so on. Libraries deal with published materials, that is, materials that are published in multiple copies, things like books, journals, media, and so on. So where an archive might have George Washington's original letters as he wrote them in his own hand, a library might have a book of the collected letters of George Washington, and that book is probably published and could be found in multiple libraries. Museums, of course, deal with other types of scientific, historical, or cultural objects. In rare cases, they may include documents, books, journals, and other types of artifacts. It can particularly cross the line when we're talking about ancient cultures. So a museum is probably more likely to have a clay tablet than either an archive or a library. But I think you probably get the canonical distinction there. So are these definitions accurate? I just mentioned, perhaps one example, the clay tablet that might not quite fit the canonical definition. Pretty much as we look at these institutions today, those definitions are generally observed, primarily but not exclusively. It would be worth it to spend some time in your discussion groups talking about possible exceptions, how some of these institutions overlap, and so on. So something for you to discuss. Curatorial practices and professions vary among the different cultural heritage institutions. So in a library, we have the librarians are the professionals, the ones that curate, if you will, the published books. Archivists curate the unique pieces of work in an archive. Museum curators, and there are other kinds of museum positions as well who deal with the artifacts. And these are distinguished by what we call their curatorial practices. And so for each one of these different kinds of organizations, the different practices have developed around the primary object. So librarians focus primarily on books. Archivists primarily focus on text objects of unpublished origin. And museum curators deal with tangible objects, different kinds of things. And of course, you may discuss most of these have additional objects as well as their primary objects. And that's something you can bring up and talk about in a little bit more detail in your discussion groups. So if we look at librarians, as we say, deal with primarily published material, books, magazines, media, that sort of thing, items that exist in multiple copies. And as such, libraries which lend out, most libraries do lending or make items available, practice item level description, that is, the individual books or items in the library are cataloged, described, notated in some kind of a finding system. And we have item level organizations, so books are classified individually, they're individually arranged on shelves, and each book is has a subject classification or a subject cataloging that goes along with it. Now, probably fewer of you are familiar with the curatorial practices of archivists. Some of you, if you're interested in archives or you've worked in them, will know this. Archives deal primarily with documents, manuscripts, correspondence, and so on. These items are unique and they're usually found in a collection. And so in archives, we arrange things by collection. So we would have a collection of the papers of George Washington. And generally, we preserve these in the order in which they came to the archive. This is sometimes called the fonds. You may run into this term at some point in your study. So where a library will take a book and they will shelve it according to some kind of classification system, an archive will generally keep things in whatever order they were received. And further, individual items in the collections are usually not, they can be, but they're usually not specifically identified. So we use collection level description. These are sometimes called finding aids. And so we might say, well, in box 3 of the George Washington collection, we have the letters he wrote to such and such on a certain subject. And the individual letters wouldn't necessarily be described. The finding aid would just say this is a collection of letters he wrote on some subject or at some particular point in time. So this is a key distinction between libraries and archives. And finally, museums, we're dealing with artifacts and objects for the most part. These items are unique even if there are similar items in the collection. So, for example, if a museum has a tray of butterflies, they might all be monarch butterflies, but each individual one has a separate collection record. It was collected on a certain date, it has a certain size, and so on. So all of the items are considered unique. Categorization is usually based on historical, geographical, geological, or anatomical distinctions rather than on some kind of a subject classification. The display involves just a selection from the collection. When you go to a museum, you don't see everything in the museum's collection. You see a selection of the collection that's designed to make specific points about the artifacts that are contained within. And then, of course, people who need to research the individual unique items within a collection go behind the displays and so on and have access to the full collection. Now, we've primarily been talking about organizations as they have existed up to toward the end of the 20th century, where we're dealing with knowledge fixed in some kind of a tangible medium, a book printed on paper, and so on. Clearly, the digital environment is really turning our idea of cultural heritage institutions, libraries, museums, and archives upside down. In IRLS 504 in later units, you're going to explore and discuss the digital information environment, some of the changes that are occurring, some of the changes in practices, some of the convergence that is now going on amongst cultural heritage institutions. And then, of course, in IRLS 671, that's an entire semester-long look, an introduction to digital collections, where we take a really kind of a deeper dive into digital curation, evolving and emerging selection, description, and display practices as collections move from physical to digitized now to born digital. So that's a brief overview, just kind of pointing out some distinctions and different kinds of organizations, practices, and so on that you need to be aware of as we move through the semester. And I look forward to seeing your response to some of this in the discussion sections. Thank you.